Hello and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about the top 10 garden pests that you might encounter in your garden. And because it's a top 10 list, and I know sometimes they can get a little monotonous, I want to change it up a little bit. So you may notice I'm wearing a t-shirt. It's like casual Fridays. I'm sitting in a camp chair, no longer on that tall stool. So just want to jump right into it, and hopefully you take away some interesting information about some of the pests that you probably are going to encounter in your garden. Thank you so much for watching this video series all about pest management and disease management. I really hope that you're enjoying it. I just wanted to let you know that this series is actually just a really small section of a much broader course all about gardening. Everything from, how to select seeds and planting seeds all the way up to harvest and kind of just everything in between. And so if this sounds like something you're interested in and really broadening your understanding in gardening, I'm going to place a link below in the description, and this will bring you to the Wild Abundance Gardening School in North Carolina. And we have a sliding scale payment system for the whole course, so you can pay what you can afford in order to have access to this wealth of knowledge. So first off are aphids. Now, aphids are an insect that you'll probably encounter in your garden or when you're gardening in some crop. And they can be really annoying. And one of the reasons why they're so annoying is when the aphids poop out the plant material, it's really sticky, and then this kind of attracts black sooty mold, and it can kind of just, it just kind of gums up everything, and it's kind of gross. In addition to that, the aphids are also, kind of sucking the life out of your plants. So aphids have a really, they have a long little snout that they insert into plants, and then they pull out the sugary goodness out of the plant phloem. Now, aphids have two stomachs, and the reason why they have this is that the plants are, if you imagine, really high pressured, because as the water is evaporating through the plant, they're kind of sucking up water from the nutrients. So if you tried to, poke a hole in it, well, it would kind of like suck the aphid into the plant. And so what the insect can do is, by having two stomachs, one stomach almost just kind of passes through the aphid, and then the other stomach kind of grabs stuff out of that high pressured stream. And so that's why aphids exude all of this junk everywhere, is because they're kind of just like blowing the plant phloem, extra phloem out of them, and then they're just sampling a little tiny bit from that really fast moving stream. Now, aphids are attracted to nitrogen-rich plants. So one way to control aphids is, when you're doing your fertilizer, to apply fertilizer that is a slower release, and is a more organic nitrogen form that isn't so readily available by the plant. And the aphids will kind of detect that, you just have this super lush plant, and then it'll become a problem. It's also important to control your aphids because aphids can vector a lot of different viruses and, bring viruses into your garden. Now, with aphids, prevention and building up your beneficials in the environment is going to be key to controlling them. So if you are growing a crop that always gets aphids every single year, you might want to do a preventative spray of, say, a rosemary oil and a cedar oil, which are both chemicals, oils that are really strong smelling, and they kind of deter aphids from feeding. So that would be a good course of action. Another thing you can do is, because aphids kind of have a softer body, when you do have a lot of aphids, insecticidal soaps can work really well on those aphids. Now, as I mentioned in my pesticide talk, it's important, if you're going to do an insecticidal soap, to make sure you get really good coverage. So make sure you get, it all over the aphids. So then those soaps can break down all those, the waxy coatings on the aphids, and then the aphids will dry out. Now, number 2 on the list is Mexican bean beetles. So Mexican bean beetles are in the same family as lady beetles, which we really like, but Mexican bean beetles, they feed on a lot of beans and cowpeas and peas and a lot of those, a lot of beans, and they can be a major problem. So if you're going to identify Mexican bean beetles, they're generally orange and have little black dots on the hard protective shell that covers their wings. Another way you can identify Mexican bean beetles is usually by their damage. So they do what is called skeletizing leaves. And now if you imagine, a skeleton is if you stripped all the flesh away, you'd be left with just, these bones. Well, if you take a leaf and you kind of mine away a lot of the green matter, you're kind of left with this kind of lacy pattern on the leaf. Now that's a skeletonized leaf. And Mexican bean beetles can do that, and it can be really devastating on your bean crops. So if you go out and you see that your bean crops are just, they're just brown, all the leaves look really different, they're not a nice leaf, they're just almost like lace. Well, you might have a problem with Mexican bean beetles. With Mexican bean beetles, they have about 2 to 3 generations per year. And if you imagine, the first generation is usually generally small, and they just get bigger and bigger as they go along. So if you can control the first generation, well, generally your other generations are going to be much smaller. So for control of Mexican bean beetles, one of the best ways to do it is row coverings. Now, by putting row coverings, you just physically prevent them from, coming onto your beans. Now, what you have to keep in mind, though, is Mexican bean beetles, they'll overwinter in the soil. And so if you put row coverings over a spot where you'd previously planted a bean plant or, cowpeas or some other type of bean, well, then those Mexican bean beetle larvae are just going to come right up into that row covering. So make sure you're also rotating where you're planting these things, and you're going to have better control over the bean beetles. Also, like a lot of insect pests, if you see the Mexican bean beetles or the eggs, well, you can pick them off, and that's going to make a huge difference in controlling those numbers. Now, the next pest is squash vine borers. Now, borers can be a real big problem in winter squash, summer squash, pumpkins. Sometimes they can attack melons and cucumbers, but mostly you're going to have problems with them in your summer squash and your winter squash. Now, why they're so devastating is the adults lay eggs down at the base of the plant, and when that egg hatches, it's this kind of like little grub that bores into the base of the plant. Now, by doing that, usually it'll lead to the death of the plant, or it can help, it'll introduce bacteria and fungi, and then the plant will die from that. So either way, it means certain death for the plant, so it's really good to control them. Now, what's nice about vine borers is they only have a single generation a year. So if you're able to control that generation, well, effectively you can do a good job of controlling the borers. So the thing about managing a single generation is you need to know when the generation is out and about. So what I found is the best way is here in the South, that adult generation generally flies around in maybe June, July. And if you can place out yellow sticky traps, well, the adults can be a little attracted to them. And once you start to see the adults, well, then you know that generation is out and about. So you can start putting out row cover and prevent those adults from getting down and laying their eggs. Now, you can also be watching, if you only have a few cucurbit plants, you can be watching to see if there are any eggs on the base of your plants. And then you're, again, going to be able to, if you just kill the eggs on the base, well, then you won't have as many problems with vine borers. Also, what you can do is after that first generation of adults flies and lays eggs, well, you can plant another succession of these squash, and you can kind of avoid those borers from even being a problem. One last tip is, because the borers lay their eggs down in the soil to overwinter, if you have a really competitive soil and lots of good cover crops, well, that's also going to help reduce the number of eggs and larvae that are going to survive in your soil over winter. Flea beetles are a small little black beetle that can leave really distinctive damage on leaves. Now, flea beetles are generally not a problem once the plant gets really big, but can be a problem when the plants are small because they can kind of overwhelm the plant. Now, you can tell if you have flea beetles not only from the distinctive patterns of chewing, but also if you go to try and catch them, they'll kind of spring away like fleas, hence the name flea beetles. In the South, there are generally about 3 to 4 generations of flea beetles per year, and like a lot of other pests, they get worse as the season progresses. So if you're going to be planting something that's susceptible to flea beetles late in the year, just know that flea beetles, are going to be at a higher number than in the beginning of the year. My favorite way to control flea beetles is using a mixture of kaolin clay and diatomaceous earth. Now, the kaolin clay, like I've said before, is a white clay, and then you mix that with the diatomaceous earth, which has all these little sharp particles in it. And this not only hides the plants from the flea beetles that are moving in, but then the diatomaceous earth also kind of gets in those beetles' little parts and bothers them, and they don't want to spend all their time there. Now again, if you're spraying little small plants trying to protect them, you're going to have to spray pretty regularly in order to cover the new leaves that develop. Otherwise, the flea beetles are just going to be feeding on that brand new leaf that pops out. Striped cucumber beetles might be one of my least favorite insects of all time. And the reason why is they're just voracious eaters, and they're also very difficult to kill. So striped cucumber beetles, like their name implies, they have a striped back, and they're really distinctive. I'm not sure exactly here in the South, but in California we also have a spotted cucumber beetle, which isn't really as big of a problem, but still can be a problem. So depending where you are, you might have problems with striped and spotted cucumber beetles. Now, cucumber beetles, kind of like flea beetles, they'll feed on those little small plants, and they can absolutely just wipe them out before they even get a chance to start. But striped cucumber beetles can also take down larger plants or damage your fruit. I think of, if you're trying to grow melons, sometimes the striped cucumber beetles will be on the bottom of the melon, just destroying that melon, just eating it all day and night. And so they can be a really big problem. So again, what I find works best for these beetles is a mixture of the kaolin clay and the diatomaceous earth. And generally I've found that that can be pretty good control. However, sometimes you can get so many cucumber beetles that it can just be overwhelming. There's nothing you can do to prevent them. And this is where you're going to need something like a pyganic or a pyrethrum spray that's really just a killer. It's going to kill those insects. Now, you have to keep in mind that cucumber beetles will also feed on the blooms of a lot of squash plants. So if you're going to try and spray a pyganic or a pyrethrum to kill these cucumber beetles, well, you don't want to kill the bees that are pollinating your crops. So you could do a nighttime application to try and, avoid accidentally hitting them. And this is why I generally start with the clay and the diatomaceous earth, so you're not also targeting the bees, which you really need in order to pollinate those crops. Cabbage loopers can be very damaging on not only cabbage, but a lot of other cole crops. Now, cabbage loopers are almost your stereotypical inchworm. So if you think of the worm that kind of, raises and lowers, it's almost like a Disney animation, it raises its middle and then lays flat, and then raises its middle and lays flat. Well, that's a looper worm. Now, the reason why loopers can be such a problem is when the adult moth lays its eggs, it can lay up to 350 eggs. Now, if you imagine if you've got a few moths flying around and they each lay, an egg mass here, egg mass, well, pretty soon you've got thousands of loopers that can cause tons of damage. So this is where it's really important, if you're out scouting, to manage the egg masses, so pluck those off and, destroy them. Or, if you have a way to capture the moths or something like that, well then, trying to control those before they lay the eggs is so much easier, or to control the eggs, versus trying to manage 350 loopers from every single egg mass. So there are all different types of worms and maggots that feed on all kinds of different crops, especially cabbages. So if you do have something you think is a worm, it's important to properly identify what it is before you do a treatment. Now, loopers, another thing, if you don't see them doing the little back arched back thing, well, what they also do is they spin a webbed cocoon in a leaf once they're done feeding before they turn into adult. So if you see webbed leaves, that could also be a sign that first generation is done feeding, and then now they're going to become moths and wreak havoc elsewhere in your garden. Now, like I've said before, this is when it's really important to catch this early, to be out in your garden and to find these egg masses. Now, say you do find egg masses and they're still just eggs. Well, if there's a ton of them and you can't just pick them off, you can watch and wait until they hatch and then come in with a BT application. And those worms, when they hatch, they'll feed on that BT and that will kill them. So that's also a great management technique if you can't just pick off the egg masses. One other great thing to control loopers is birds. Now, you're going to have to look in your specific area because bird populations vary, pretty dramatically. So it's important to know, how you can modify your environment to encourage birds to be in your area. You can put up birds boxes that have specific size holes, which allow different birds to nest there, and then they're going to go out and try and, feed their young and eat a lot of those loopers, which, are eating your cabbages. The next pest is tomato hornworms. Now, tomato hornworms are these beautiful, huge worms that have, these very distinctive horns on them. Now, hornworms are generally not really a problem if we know that they're there and to control them. They're fairly easy to control. But they can be really problematic if we don't see them. They're very camouflaged and they can just kind of do their thing. So say we leave our tomato plants alone for a week or something like that, you can come back and wow, like where'd the tomato plant even go? Because the hornworms, ate it all away. So to control hornworms, there are two generations per year. And that first generation, if that one's a really big generation, well, your next generation is also going to be really big. So trying to reduce that first generation will greatly reduce the second generation. One of the greatest control measures for hornworms is to just pick them off and get rid of them. And so again, this takes just being out in your garden and finding them. Now, there's also lots of parasitic wasps that love to parasitize and lay their eggs inside of hornworms. So again, if you have a robust, beneficial population, this is going to do a really good job controlling the hornworms. Now, if you're still having problems with hornworms, you have a big tomato patch, you can't pick them off, you're not getting a lot of beneficials, well, BT also does a great job controlling hornworms, and because they're such voracious eaters, usually they eat so much BT that, that most of them die after that first or second application. So on the list of my least favorite bugs, up next is the Harlequin bug. Now, Harlequin bugs can be super damaging and they can just, take off like crazy. Now, one of the problems with Harlequin bugs is when they feed, they can inject a toxin as well that really damages the plants. So sometimes you'll see this on your winter cole crops if they're covered in Harlequin bugs. Well, the plants are kind of deformed and funky looking. So controlling Harlequin bugs is really important if you want to grow the plants that are, susceptible to Harlequin bugs. Now, depending on where you live, Harlequin bugs, if it's too cold, they're going to hibernate during the winter, and you won't have to worry about them as much other than the shoulder, fall, and spring season. If you do live in a warmer state, then these can be a really big problem if, you're trying to grow broccoli or kale or things like that in the winter. One of the reasons why they can become such a problem is a single female can lay almost 150 eggs. And so these females, what they do is they go on the underside of the leaf and they lay the eggs in a really distinctive row pattern. So sometimes because they're underneath the leaf, they can be hard to find. And if you miss them, well, then you're going to have a lot of different Harlequin bugs that are going to be all over your plants. One great way to control Harlequin bugs is to control their overwintering environment. So, they need a place to stay all winter. And so if they're overwintering in your field and then you go out and plow it, or if you have a cover crop that they're overwintering and you go in and mow it, well, that can effectively control Harlequin bugs. One thing that they really like is mustard plants. So if you have mustard plants growing around your garden as weeds, if you remove those, you can also help, eliminate a host that those Harlequin bugs want to overwinter on. Another great way to control Harlequin bugs is using row covers. But again, you need to make sure that you're using the row covers before they get in there to lay their eggs, or you've just created a nice protected environment for those eggs to hatch, and then the Harlequin bugs to just go crazy, underneath your row cover. Now, squash bugs can be recognized by their long, gray body and their really long proboscis that they use to probe into plants when they're feeding on the plant sap. And that's what makes them such a bad pest, is they just probe right in and suck a lot of the sap or the good phloem out of your plants and cause problems. Now, squash bugs, like their name implies, love squash, zucchini, and pumpkins. The adults fly in and they lay these little copper colored eggs all over everything. And they often lay them in little clusters in little rows. And so by controlling the eggs, again, you can do a great job of controlling the adults. Now, squash bugs can be, they can really proliferate really fast. So trying to control the eggs if you can in that first generation is going to be one of your best bets for also controlling the adults later. Now, one of the most disheartening pests that often can exist in our gardens is cutworms. And the reason why they're so disheartening is you'll plant all your seeds out and you'll get all these beautiful little seedlings and you'll come back the next day and they'll all just be sliced off. They all just look like someone went out there and just chainsawed them down. And so oftentimes that can be signs that you have cutworms. So cutworms, what they do is they emerge from the soil when they're about a ½ inch long, and they just feed right around the stem of your plant, and then it'll fall over. So to tell if you have cutworms, you can go out usually in the morning, and if you see plants that have fallen over, they love corn and a lot of other plants. If you've seen them, they're just fallen over on the ground, well, that could mean that you have cutworms. Now, one of the greatest products we have for controlling cutworms is a product called Seduce. Now, Seduce, I know it's kind of a funny name, but Seduce is an insect bait that is, it's made up of a product called spinosad. And spinosad is a bacterium that works to kill the worms if they eat it. So you can sprinkle this bait out around your plants and the cutworms will go for the bait rather than the actual plant. Now, what you can also do is if you know that you have cutworms and cutworms have always been a problem for you, well, then you can put out the bait preemptively and then you won't have to worry about the cutworms going for your plants. They'll go for the bait. Another way to control cutworms is when you incorporate your cover crop or you prepare your bed to plant whatever you're going to plant, let it rest for a few weeks and it'll just kind of give a chance for the soil to kind of equilibrate. But then also those cutworms, they're going to kind of be starving. They're going to think that you're going to plant right into it and they're going to get food in no time. Well, if you let it sit for a few weeks, well, those cutworms, they kind of missed out and you're not going to get as many cutworms as if you just planted right into a bed. So this has been a real quick, just top 10 insect pests, and I hope that maybe it'll help you kind of identify some of the insects that you've been seeing. And maybe you've seen an insect, you never knew what it was, and so hopefully some of these photos can kind of trigger things. And if you can always do more research and look up the specific life cycles, and then also look in your area, because what we're doing here in North Carolina in our area might be different from where you're growing, although it's the same insect pest.